Shalom. Thank God, Jim and Carol are doing well and feeling much better. So we sat down this week and recorded an episode of our podcast, but due to a technical problem, Jim's audio and video was not captured. Nevertheless, we thought to share with you some important points that we brought up about careful speech and about life and death. Next week, with Hashem's help, we hope to be back for a full episode. I want to mention, we're talking about Yaakov losing that prophecy and not speaking. And this concept of not speaking is a major theme of this parsha. It's not all overt. This is the most overt example of how, and even this is according to our understanding, but we're just saying the verse can't be understood any other way because he was about to do one thing and he ended up saying something else. So that's the tradition that that he lost that prophecy, and I've taught about this many times, and we have our weekly portions from previous years that are up. We talk about the whole concept of why it was taken away from him. That it wasn't something that Hashem wanted us to know. But the other examples of not speaking that are not so well known are first of all, the parsha begins right, and it's like the happiest years for Yaakov and Yosef. Really, they're united. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. And the days of Yaakov, the years of his life, were 147 years. That's in chapter 47 and verse 28. I always marveled about the fact that there are exactly 17 words in that verse. And of course, 17 in Gematria, Tov is good. 17 is Tov, which is good. So everything about that verse is just this aura broadcasting, a certain kind of completion, of perfection. This was the happiest time of Yaakov's life because he was finally reunited. And that was kind of in a way, like a golden age for the children of Israel there in Goshen, in that ghetto, as it were, before the axe fell, But the thing is, what is incredible about this whole story is this art of not speaking, perhaps foreshadowing Yaakov not giving over the secret, being prevented from giving over the secret. But one of the strangest verses is that we have in chapter 48, the first verse, as it begins, as it came to pass after these things, that someone said to Yosef, "Behold, your father is ill." So he took his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him. How do we even understand that verse? In other words, Yosef had to be told that his father was ill. And so, okay, I might think, well, after all, Yosef is an important figure, and he probably had his offices in the capital, and he was busy with affairs of state all day, and so he wasn't constantly by his father's side, so he had to be informed. That's what I might have thought if we wanted to just come up with a simple explanation. That makes sense. That does make sense, but that's not the answer. The answer is so startling, and Chazal tell us, our sages tell us the most extraordinary thing. It's absolutely stunning. They tell us, and this is why I preface this whole thing with it, there were such happy years. I mean, they had such a tremendous bond, Yaakov and Yosef, and they're finally back together. Chazal say that all during those 17 years, Yosef barely spoke with Yaakov, and never alone. That Yosef went out of his way to make sure that all throughout the rest of his life, he never was found alone with Yaakov, and indeed, he didn't frequent him all that often. You would have thought, like his father is already a senior citizen. A lot of people build like an extra apartment in their home for their parents. It's a concept. Here in Israel, it's very common. We have a special unit that we want our parents to take care of our parents. They took care of us. You'd think that Yosef, with a pretty much unlimited budget, certainly could have set up his father at least in the basement apartment with his own little shower and kitchen. Like what kind of thing? He must have certainly lived at least next door to him. But it turns out no, and it turns out Chazal say that Yosef was careful never to be alone with Yaakov. He always had at least one other person with him. Why? This is absolutely so mind-boggling. Who, again, as I said in this past week's Torah portion, we don't understand who Yosef was. We simply don't understand who this man was. Yosef took all these precautions because he never wanted to be in a situation wherein his father would finally be able to corner him and say, okay, now tell me what really happened. In other words, my position in this whole thing, just from a scholarly point of view, because I've researched this very thoroughly, is that from the get-go, Yaakov did not believe that Yosef was dead. But he also did not know the truth, ever. He didn't know exactly what the circumstances were. He just knew that he was not supposed to know, and that they were not telling him the truth. But Yosef was, what I want to point out is that Yosef was so, I don't know what the word is, so extreme in his dedication to his brothers and his not wanting them to be embarrassed or in any way for their stature to be diminished or to drive any sort of a wedge between them and their father. He took these very, very elaborate pains that I'm sure were indeed painful for him, because he really, his relationship with his father was muted, because he was so concerned about not being put in a situation where he would have to speak lashon hara about his brothers and tell Yaakov what really happened. That's how dedicated he was to keeping the peace. And so too, another aspect of the not speaking in this parsha is Benjamin, because Benjamin, who was not involved in the sale, yet he knew the truth. He knew what the brothers had done, but he also took it upon himself never to say a word. And that's why the stone on the breastplate of Benjamin, the stone on the breastplate of the high priest, the stone of Benjamin, is called yashpeh, which is generally translated as the opal. That's another question. What is it? How do we understand it today? But the yashpeh is the Hebrew word for the stone. Literally, the word reads yesh peh, meaning there is a mouth. That was the stone of Benjamin. Why was that the stone of Benjamin? He didn't speak. Exactly. Because the measure of a mouth is not using it. It's not using it. So his stone was actually in honor of the fact that he knew how not to speak. And that is just, the whole thing is so amazing, because today talk is so cheap and everybody says whatever they want, whether it's in actual speech or for the preferred method of speaking, which is through an emoji or through capital letters or through anything else. People speak without thinking in the least bit, and a person can cause tremendous irrevocable damage to someone else's reputation, and we do it without any sort of thinking whatsoever. It's the opposite of how people are today. This whole idea of being careful with what one says. Just so many incredible life lessons in this Torah portion. Before the chain of events that occurred yesterday with the passing of a very dear friend of ours that I told you about here in Israel. Before that, after Shabbat this past week, I got a message that someone passed away, a different person, a man who I knew for over 50 years, who was the father of children that I became friends with when I was very, very, very young, back in the 70s. And I went to his funeral, and I was surprised when I got there to see that so many people were there on a Saturday night. Hundreds and hundreds of people were there, and he wasn't a famous man. He was a very, very simple shopkeeper and very humble and modest person. And I see that the first person who got up to eulogize him was none other than the chief rabbi of Israel. And I was absolutely surprised to see it. And he spoke about his attributes, how modest he was and what a tremendous student of Torah he was, and a supporter of Torah scholars, and how much he loved Hashem, and he loved the Torah. And several of his sons, or old friends of mine, got up to eulogize him. And they spoke about one particular aspect of his personality, which is this very thing that we're talking about now, that he never spoke. He never spoke. about anyone, and he spoke very little because he was so concerned about saying the wrong thing all the time. And he spoke, and they mentioned how at the Shabbat table, for example, which is the time when the whole family comes together and everybody's finally able to kind of like review the week and let off some steam and talk together. He never allowed a word to be said about any other person. And I'm remembering this now from a Shabbat that I spent at that table over 40 years ago. I'm remembering that now, how when anybody's name came up, he right away said, don't speak at all. And it was just so amazing, that attribute that they were talking about, how he, even when there was some argument with some neighbor who very grievously injured them for no reason, very grievously hurt them, and the neighbor was obviously, something was really wrong with them. What I would say, this woman was out of her mind. They just did this terrible torture of this family. He said to his children, don't say anything bad about her. She's a very unfortunate person. Don't say anything bad about her. And how, he obviously worked on that attribute and made it his own, like we talked earlier about acquiring something on a soul level. And then they were talking about more things about this person. And one of the children, who's now like a great rabbi in his 50s, was talking about when he was a little boy, like in 4th grade, how the father took him and said, I need your help. And the boy was like, what do you need my help for? As a little boy, he said, I need your help. And they were talking about how he was such a generous person and of himself, of modest means, but he never denied helping anyone that he could. He just was so large and just emptying his pockets to whoever asked him. But the fellow was talking about how one day he took his son, who was then a little boy, and he went and he bought 11 chickens. And he bought the chickens live, and then he took the chickens to be shechted, right, to a butcher. Now, in those days, it wasn't like it is today, where there's all sorts of ready-made things and everything is packaged and everything. In those days, in Israel, back in the late 60s, you had to take care of these things. So anyway, so he bought these chickens, had them butchered, and then he had his son. He said, "I'm going to wait out here. I want you to take these chickens into this shop and ask them to take off all the feathers and to section them. I don't want him to see me. You do it." And the child doesn't understand what's going on. And so far, the father hasn't shown himself to any of these people. And then he has all the chickens ready, and then he says to his son, "This is what I want you to do." He had a list of people. And he's going around to different houses, and he's saying to his son, "Okay, now on this floor, in this building, on such and such a floor, such and such an apartment, is this and this family. Knock at the door and give them this chicken, and then just leave. Don't say a word, just leave." And the son didn't know what was going on until later. He understood that his father was just this angel who took it upon himself to provide for all these poor people. And he didn't want anybody to know about it. And he said to his son, this is the punchline that I almost forgot. He said to his son, "Don't ever tell anyone about today. Don't ever tell anyone what you saw." And the son, who was eulogizing his father and crying, was saying, "Now that you're gone, I'm allowed to tell everybody. Now that you're gone." So he was so absolutely self-effacing that he didn't want any credit. He didn't want anybody to know about it. He didn't want anybody to give him any sort of honor for that kind of thing, and that goes hand in hand with this other attribute that they spoke about, that he was so careful not to speak a word about anyone else. And again, this is what we take with us to the next world. We take with us what we were able to accomplish on a soul level, what we did for other people, and. Yesterday, I had our Zoom class, and I dedicated it in the memory of our friend, your friend and ours, Mrs. Cohen, who passed away suddenly. And and she had been a regular member of our Jerusalem Lights Zoom community, and she was always on the first page, the first 25 people or so, and she was always first. She was very, very devoted to Torah study, and So I dedicated our learning to her memory and to the ascent of her soul. And I told all of our friends that were at the Zoom, I said, this is a familiar face to you, and she's not here now. And that was an opportunity just to speak a little bit about these kind of things, because what I said is that, we all suffer loss. And many of us, especially as we get older, we're no stranger to loss. And those of us who haven't yet will, because that's what it means to be a human being. That's the human condition. But the thing is that we believe that there is another world. And even as we say that, and even as we learn that, and even as we emphasize that, sometimes even for us, it's hard for us to remember that and to believe it, because we are so conditioned by this world. And we're so totally kind of like fixated on our own physicality, and our existence is so base because we are physical beings, and it's such an effort for us to rise above the illusion of the material world. But our sages emphasize that basically, to be perfectly frank, that this world is a lie, and that nothing is real in this world, and that the real world is the world of truth, and that actually this world is a dream. This is the dream. This is the illusion, and the eternity of the soul in the light of Hashem, which is forever, is the real world, as it were. And again, we're not putting this world down. It's a very fine line, because we are totally fixated on this world because it's the one that we have, and Hashem loves it, and Hashem created it, and he created it for the purpose of man, and he put us in it to test us, which is the purpose of man. The benefit of man is best by test. This is why he placed us in this world. But the fact is, it is a challenge to walk that kind of like a tightrope and remember that the main thing about this world is what we do with it, with our time in it, what we accomplish, and not to waste that time in that. And that's why it's so inspiring. Like I went to that funeral. I wasn't myself feeling so well, and it was late and everything. And I felt so transformed by seeing this, by hearing these beautiful things about this person that I knew basically my entire life, and I never knew these things about him, which is the way he wanted it, because he was so steadfast in his total true humility and goodness, and so hearing these things is a tremendous inspiration to a person who's still alive. That's why we have that verse that it's better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting, because the living person takes it to heart and understands how important it is for us to be motivated in this world. And when you are very close to someone that all of a sudden is gone, in a moment, you realize that everything else is absolutely ridiculous. And the only thing that matters is the eternity of the soul. And that is why we emphasize so much in our daily prayers the whole concept of the resurrection of the dead. It's not just kind of like balm on a wound. It's not just kind of like sour grapes, or like some sort of empty kind of like a conciliation. It's the truth. It's the real truth, is that there is a whole nother dimension of reality. And I also realized and shared this with our friends and community that, we always talk about how the day of death is more important than the day of birth, and I always explain that, on the anniversary of the passing, well, the soul rises higher every year, and it's the greater light in the world. But the truth is that, even on a simpler level, the idea is that the yahrzeit, the day of passing, is actually the real birthday. Because it's an entirely new chapter of the person's life. It's not the end. It's the end of the envelope. It's the end of the body, but it's not. But it's the beginning for the journey of the soul. These are things that we repeat, and that we, as a mantra, and that we try to internalize, and we try to review. But they are so important for us to hold fast as truth, because this is really the interesting thing is, here again, this week is the 10th of Tevet. It's actually tomorrow, Tuesday, is the fast day of the 10th of Tevet, which commemorates the beginning of the siege that Nebuchadnezzar made around Jerusalem, which led to the destruction of the Holy Temple. And really, the whole idea is, that we're fighting forces that are trying to subdue the truth. That's the whole idea of the building of the temple, is that it brings about a total realization of Hashem's presence amongst us, right? And I mentioned as soon as we began today are these 3 days of Tevet, right? Yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Here, by the time our recording goes up, people won't understand the context. But this week, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, are 3 days that are the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th of Tevet. In Talmudic times, when people had a stronger constitution, it was customary to fast for all 3 days. And now, in our time, all of Israel fasts on the 10th day of Tevet, which is actually biblical, mentioned in the prophets. It's the day of the siege around Jerusalem that led to the destruction. But yesterday, which was the 8th of Tevet, was also a noteworthy day, because it was the day in which the Torah was forcibly translated into Greek under the orders of the Greek Egyptian king Ptolemy. And that was viewed by our sages as a day of terrible disaster. They even said that the day that the Torah was translated into Greek, the world was plunged into darkness. And it was likened to the day of the worship of the golden calf. So I explained the whole idea. I mean, it's not that we're against translations. In fact, if it wouldn't be for translations of the Torah that we have today, that so many hundreds of thousands of people rely on, the scholarly, excellent translations like Art Scroll and Judaica Press, then because of those translations, so many people have access to Torah. But the important thing is for people to realize that there's always something lacking in a translation, even the very, very best. And our motivation has to be to try and study the Hebrew, because the real beauty and jewels and treasures of the secrets of the Torah are reflected only in the Hebrew. And so the reason that this was such a disaster, and why the sages went to the extent of saying that it was literally plunging the world into darkness, and like with worshiping the golden calf, is because the whole idea of the golden calf is that it's an illusion. And that people thought, I have something tangible that I can focus on, an intermediary, a go-between. And not that they actually thought it was God, but they just needed something to fixate on, because it takes such a powerful spiritual maturity to realize that we're out there in the universe and Hashem has no end, and you have to deal with that, and it's very overwhelming. So when you have something, especially like a man God, that is I can relate to, or any kind of totem, that makes it a little bit easier, kind of like a step down. And so that was the problem with worshiping the golden calf, and so that's why the metaphor, comparing that to a translation of the Torah, is so perfect, because when a person has a translation, they think, now I have it. This is it. And so now the Greeks were able to say, I'll tell you what the Torah says. I have it too. And in fact, we have today many people who have an agenda, who echo the very same thing, who say, we'll tell you what the Torah says. We have it right here. We have the King James Version. We have Bible Hub. We have all of these, the New American Bible, and all of these things will tell you what it says. And so the idea is, the danger is in thinking that this is it. Not that we should not have access to Torah in the language that we need, but that we have to understand that every word and every letter is so sacred and is so laden with tremendous meaning. It has to come from a place that is based on the tradition of Sinai, and the whole irony of these days now, in a way, like the 8th of Tevet, the day of the translation of the Torah into Greek. Hanukkah is the only holiday that begins in one month and ends in the next month. It began at the end of Kislev, 25th of Kislev, and it went into the first few days of Tevet. So that in itself is so amazing, because the month of Tevet began with the light of Hanukkah, but then right away now we're already coming to like this period of mourning for the temple and our desire to see the temple rebuilt. So it started with a temple rededication festival, and now the very next week we're already commemorating a fast day of the siege of of Jerusalem. But the whole idea of what Hanukkah was all about is that everything that we're discussing now, right? I'm talking about that wonderful man and the inspiration of his soul, that he tried to do good in the world without anybody knowing. And I'm talking about our belief that can't be proven, that the dead will come to life and that the soul is eternal. Those were all things that the Greeks outlawed. The Greeks outlawed believing in anything that you cannot demonstrate scientifically. They outlawed anything that was not the worship of form and materialism and scientific fact. I know you're aware of this. Our sages teach us that there was a miracle because Ptolemy took these 72 sages and sequestered them in 72 different rooms, and they had no communication with each other, but by Ruach HaKodesh, as it were, divine inspiration, they each made the same slight change in 13 different places in the Torah that they understood, that if they were translated literally, there would be a tremendous misunderstanding. So I'm saying that the Greeks outlawed everything that we hold sacred in their enlightened wisdom. They outlawed belief in the eternity of the soul and in Tchiyat HaMetim, and the resurrection of the dead. So for those folks to have the translation and to say, now we'll tell you what the Torah, that now I understand why our sages say that it was such an unmitigated disaster, and why it's like the golden calf, because that kind of agenda is a total illusion. Let's bless all of our viewers and listeners with a wonderful week here in the month of Tevet, and may we merit to see the fast of the 10th of Tevet turn into a day of joy and rebuilding.